The early 1900s was a time when organized crime was at its peak in America. With gangsters running rampant across the country, it was only a matter of time before they entered the business of making motion pictures. But this led to a problem for the authorities. How do you stop a gang war that's being waged on celluloid? It all started with the production of the very first gangster film, The Steno Man from 1912. This film is considered the first gangster film ever made because it follows the story of a man who turns to a life of crime after he loses his job. But despite its success, it was long before the studios realized that there was money to be made by making films about real-life gangsters. And so it began. For decades, Hollywood had been churning out gangster films based on the exploits of real-life mobsters. Some were semi-biographical while others were completely made up, but they all contributed to the myth and lore of organized crime. It was during this time that some of the most iconic gangster movies were made, such as The Public Enemy, Little Caesar, The Untouchables, and many more. These films were not only entertaining, but they also helped to popularize the image of the gangster in American culture. The popularity of these films led to a surge in the number of gangsters in America. Young men across the country wanted to emulate their favorite movie stars and become gangsters themselves. It was as if Hollywood had given them permission to live out their fantasies of power and violence. The problem was that these fantasies were becoming all too real. Gang wars erupted across the country as rival gangs fought for control of the lucrative rackets. People were being killed left and right, and it seemed like the only way to stop it was to make more gangster films. It might sound crazy, but it actually happened. In an effort to put an end to the gang wars, the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors Association of America banned the production of any more gangster films. But why did this association have the power to ban films in the first place? To understand this, we have to take a look at how the film industry worked back then. The film industry was largely controlled by 5 major companies, which meant that there was very little room for independent producers. If you wanted to make a movie, you had to get permission from one of these companies. They weren't in the habit of giving out permission lightly. In fact, they had formed a self-regulating body called the MPPDA, which was tasked with censoring any films that could be deemed offensive or controversial. This included films that glorified violence, crime, or immorality. So when the MPPDA learned about the violent gang wars that were raging across the country, they decided to act. They issued a decree banning the production of any more gangster films. This was a drastic move, but it was one that was ultimately successful in curbing the violence. Gangster films were no longer being made, and the public's fascination with gangsters began to fade away. But it was long before another group came along and decided to pick up where the others left off. This new group was called the Mafia. The Mafia is an Italian term for a group of people who are closely related to each other. It can refer to a family, clan, or even a criminal organization. In the United States, the term is often used to refer to organized crime groups, particularly those of Italian descent. The Mafia has been around since the 1800s, and they quickly became involved in the production of films. At first, they were content to stay behind the scenes, providing the necessary connections and resources to make a film. But as time went on, they began to take a more active role. They started producing their own films, and they were willing to go much further than the Hollywood studios. The Mafia didn't care about censorship or public opinion. They were only interested in making money. And they were willing to do whatever it took to achieve that goal, even if it meant resorting to violence. One of their first major productions was The Public Enemy in 1931. The film was a huge success, both critically and commercially, and it showed the world what the Mafia was capable of. They followed this up with a string of other hit films, including Little Caesar, The Untouchables, and many more. These films were not only popular with audiences, they also made a lot of money for the Mafia. In fact, it's estimated that the Mafia made millions of dollars from the production and distribution of gangster films. This money was then used to fund their other criminal activities, such as gambling, prostitution, and drug trafficking. So you can see how the line between fiction and reality was becoming increasingly blurred. The Mafia was now heavily invested in the production of gangster films, and they were able to use these films to promote their own criminal activities. But the authorities were not going to stand for this. They knew that the Mafia was using the films to recruit new members and to intimidate their rivals, so they began to crack down. Law enforcement officials started to raid Mafia-owned theaters and seize their films. They also began to arrest Mafia members on charges related to the production and distribution of illegal films. But the Mafia was not going to be deterred so easily. They fought back against the authorities, and the battle between them raged on. In the end, it was the Mafia who came out on top. They continued to produce gangster films for decades, and they were able to use these films to build their criminal empire. But eventually the tide began to turn. As the years went on, the popularity of gangster films began to decline. People were no longer interested in seeing stories about ruthless criminals, and the Mafia was forced to scale back their production. Today, the Mafia is still around, but they are a shadow of their former selves. They no longer have the same power or influence, and they certainly aren't making the same kind of films. But their legacy lives on in the classic gangster films that they produced during their heyday. Gangster films had become so popular that they were practically a staple of Hollywood. But the authorities were becoming increasingly concerned about the influence that these films were having on young people. They were worried that the films were glorifying crime and making it seem like a glamorous and exciting way of life. As a result, they began to put pressure on the studios to clean up their act. They demanded that the films be more realistic and less sympathetic to the gangsters. But the studios were not going to change their ways without a fight. They argued that the films were simply a form of entertainment, and that people should not take them seriously. They also claimed that the films were actually helping to fight crime by giving people an outlet to vicariously experience the excitement of a gangster lifestyle. Eventually, the authorities got their way, and the studios were forced to make changes. This led to a decline in the popularity of gangster films during the 1940s and 1950s. But the genre would make a comeback in the 1970s with films like The Godfather, Dog Day Afternoon, and many more. These films were darker and more violent than their predecessors, but they were also more realistic. They portrayed gangsters as complex characters with both positive and negative traits, rather than simply as ruthless killers. Despite their popularity, these films were still controversial, and they faced opposition from the authorities. But the studios were no longer willing to back down. They had seen how much money gangster films could make, and they were not going to let the authorities take that away from them. The result was a new era of gangster films that pushed the boundaries of violence and immorality. One of the most notorious of these films was Scarface from 1983. The film was incredibly violent. It pushed the limits of what was considered acceptable for a mainstream film. Despite the controversy, Scarface became a cult classic, and it remains one of the most influential gangster films ever made. But this was not the end of the story. The authorities continued to crack down on gangster films, and they were able to get several films banned. One of the most notable of these was The Last Don from 1996. The film was based on the true story of Michael Franzese, a mafia captain who turned government witness. The authorities were concerned that the film would glorify the mafia and make it seem like an attractive career option for young people. As a result, they put pressure on the studios to pull the plug on the film. In the end, the authorities were successful, and the film was never released. So the next time you sit down to watch your favorite gangster film, just remember that it could have been a lot different. With a few key decisions, the landscape of gangster films could have been drastically altered. What would you have done differently? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, then check out some of my other videos about the history of crime, and don't forget to subscribe for more content. Thanks for watching.